Good afternoon, Marco.
Hello.
Good afternoon, everyone. Siguro let's give it another minute or two. No? Thanks for joining. Okay, sige. I think we can start. No, there's 7 of us. I hope others can join. No, later on. Not sure if we're always getting less than 15 people, so I'm not sure if if people are just so busy or you have very difficult classes, pero sige lang, we'll still proceed. No? In any case, I still post the recordings naman on Canvas, no? For those who cannot join. But thank you again. I see familiar faces and really thank you for regularly joining my classes. It makes it less lonely. And I hope you pick up a thing or two. No. Sige. So tonight, no, I don't think this will be a long session. No? I'm gonna recap, or if you haven't covered it in Canvas, I'm gonna be doing an introduction for the second part, no, of this module. No? And then next week we'll cap off module 3 and introduce module 4, no, next week. So let's do that. So just a few things. Again, at any time, if you have questions, you have comments, please stop me, and raise your hand or type in the chat box. So again, suggested pace. Hopefully, you're already on module 3. And thanks for submitting your assignments. I think most of you already submitted your assignments. There's only one or two. As I said, late assignments are okay, but it will merit a 5-point deduction for each day that it's late. So, sige lang. Suggested pace again, so maybe by October 18, if you're able to finish module 3, no? I'll be posting module 4 by October 18, okay, or at least the first parts. No, module 4 will be will consist of 4 parts. No, it's the most lengthy part of this course. All right, so today we're still going to be reviewing some of the more traditional approaches. No, last time we talked about Rostow, Harold Dumar, and your free market, laissez-faire, unabated things, and then we ended with my particular preference. Again, it's not the official school or Jesuit preference, no, the social democracy paradigm. No? It is my own preference. No? And later on, I'll be, after we talk about the neo-Marxist and the false paradigm models, I'll be talking about the spectrum from no government to purely government control, just to sort of summarize the different governance structure models. So today, we'll talk about structuralist, the structuralist model, no? Basically the Lewis dual sector model. It's sort of an elaboration, or it aligns well actually with Rostow. Then we'll talk about the Marxist paradigm, and then we'll talk about dependency models. At various points in this class, I'll be asking you, for those of you who've already gone through this in the module, just help us summarize, or if you can. If not naman, okay lang. I'll still continue. Then dependency models, you have the neo-Marxist, no? This is basically it's like the tension between the North, the richer countries, versus the South countries, the South, North, South, or First World versus Third World. And then the false paradigm. And then I'll end with the spectrum. So let's jump. All right. So first, now, before we talk about the Lewis dual factor, I'll be reviewing 2 important concepts first, before we dive into the model. I hope some of you have at least covered this on Canvas already. So Rostow, as you notice, it's basically a shift, from agriculture, then going into manufacturing, a very strong manufacturing, and then you diversify the economy even more. Later on, we'll be learning that the economy in general is composed of 3 major sectors: agriculture, manufacturing, and services. So for Rostow, it's sort of that linear approach. First, you graduate from a predominantly agriculture-oriented economy, then to a more to a heavier emphasis on manufacturing. Then after that, it's heavy manufacturing as well as services. Now, when we say services, that's your accommodation, that's your financial services, banking. Services are basically intangibles. So from haircuts to catering to whatever, BPOs, for example, those are services. So that's Rosto. No? So graduating from backward agri to manufacturing. There's another concept I just wanted, because again, as some of you may have studied this in high school, most of you. But before we go to Lewis, no, because this is an important thing, no, just wanted to revisit the supply and of the law of demand and the law of supply. You see this, no? This should be very basic for most of you. So this is the supply and demand curve, no? So on the y-axis, you have the price of a good, whatever that is. Here on the x-axis is quantity. So the demand is downward sloping. No? That's the demand curve. And the supply is upward sloping. No? I'm going through this fast because I assume most of you already know this. No? Or if you don't, if you haven't really studied this concept, this is very intuitive. So for any good in general, no, 99% of the time, no, when the price, no, when the price goes down, no, let's go for the demand first, no. When the price goes down, for example, 50 yung price, no. If the price goes to 40, then there is more demand. Instead of 1,000 people wanting it, you have 2,000 people wanting it now. 2,000 units of it. So, on the other hand naman, suppliers, diba? From the buyer's perspective, that's not good, diba? Of course, you want your price to rise or to just maintain being at a high level. No? So, baliktad, no? For supply naman, when the price goes down, no, let's say 50 to 40, less suppliers or less sellers are willing to sell. Diba? Uurong siya konti, are willing to sell. So, supply goes down. On the flip side, you can expect the reverse. No? The price goes up naman. So for example, from let's say 20 pesos or dollars, whatever, it became 50. So kita nyo, from 4,000 units yung demand, it became 1,000. Baliktad naman for supply. No, price goes up, of course, I want to sell diba? More because there's an incentive for the seller. No? So it's a different viewpoint. No? The equilibrium is the point at which they compromise, the point at which the buyers and sellers. So that's basic. So before we jump into the Lewis dual factor model, you have the Rosto, agri, manufacturing, then manufacturing combined with services, and then you have the supply and demand curve. It's the same with wages. No? So just think that anything in life now, once you've mastered the law of supply and demand, you can analyze the price and the movement of different things in economic terms very well already. A lot of the phenomenon of pricing can be explained by supply and demand, even the basic supply and demand curves. So let's study Lewis dual factor. And again, we're studying all of these models not because they are perfect and not because they are completely useless, but we're trying to get what is good out of them. What are the good practices that they're trying to recommend? In modern economics kasi, GDP, diba, we already discussed this. It's the usual computation is C plus I plus G plus NX. There's also an alternative way of looking at the GDP or the economy as a whole. No? It's by sectoral composition. So in modern economics, as I keep mentioning, there are three broad sectors: agriculture, manufacturing, and services. Before, kasi the Lewis model was done in the early 1900s yata. It was usually dual economy pa lang, agri or versus manufacturing. The more countries become more affluent, the more you would expect services to be a bigger chunk. The more people will need um, financial services, cleaning services, tourism services, etc., etc. Pero before, dalawa lang. It's like two sides to one coin. No? Agriculture or industry. Medyo mutually exclusive. That's how they saw it before. So yun. So going back to Lewis, no. So before, again, assume first that there are only two sides of the economy: agriculture and manufacturing. Again, think of manufacturing or investment as factories. That's your parang mental mnemonic, no? Mental shortcut for industry, manufacturing. Sometimes industry kasi synonymous to manufacturing. So it harks back to the Rostov's early stage. No? So imagine there is this country. No? There is a lot of surplus labor in the countryside. Pag sinabi mo kasing surplus labor, no, there's a lot of people unemployed. No, they're not needed in the farms, for example. No? In economic terms, a surplus usually means the marginal productivity of labor is zero. And I will explain that, no, for those of you not super familiar with economic terms. Remember, marginal means additional in economics. No? An incremental increase. Usually, an additional unit, plus one. Ganun na lang. Think of it as a plus one. Parang na-foul siya, may free throw siya dahil kasi pumasok, and one. So think of marginal productivity, if you're a fan of basketball, as an and one, plus one. So here, in the countryside, in the rural side, no, what Lewis was saying, no, all economies usually start this way. There is, when you say there's a surplus labor in the countryside, ibig sabihin, there's excess labor. No? So meaning, if for example, dahil there's excess labor, there's already a farm. Let's say the farm has 10 workers. No? When you say the marginal productivity of labor is zero, the 10 farm workers are able to produce, let's say, 100 cabans of mangoes. If you add an 11th worker, it will not change. The output of that farm will still be 100 cabans of mangoes or rice, whatever. Yan yung sinasabi natin that the marginal productivity of labor equals zero. So that person is not needed. Hence, that person is not employed. Kasi, di ba, if you are a farm owner, why will you hire that person? Medyo useless naman. Di ba? Tapos, there's another thing, no? Tapos, as you know naman, one thing to remember is the wages in the rural side are lower than the urban centers. So that's the first phenomenon. So imagine there's a situation, and all countries start this way, no? Because it's mostly agriculture. Now, you start having manufacturing or industrial production in urban areas. What's going to happen now is because there is excess labor, surplus nga kasi they're not needed because they don't add anything. Zero yung kanilang value added. So what happens is the unemployed in the rural side, no, unskilled, unemployed, sabi nila, ay, okay, I'm gonna look for opportunities. What will end up happening is, in the urban areas, there are vacancies. So what will happen is manufacturing in the urban areas would now attract the surplus rural labor, no? Not just because there is opportunity, but because inherently the wages are higher. So ganon. What's going to happen is profits are flowed by businesses as investment, no? So yun, the industry now becomes a virtuous cycle where, you keep on enticing workers, and then your business grows, you keep producing, you keep selling, and then you want to expand. Then all the more that you sort of pull in more workers from the rural side. So you keep doing that, no, as a business. So what will happen? Sorry, it's already in the last slide. No, I thought I sort of deleted that. So what will happen now if that keeps happening? What will happen to labor in the rural side? Or what will happen to the urban centers? What do you guys think? Remember, there's surplus labor, and then yung mga excess labor na yan, no? The urban centers now are attracting those because of higher wages, no? And in the first place, they don't have jobs in the rural side. So what do you think? Sige, Marco, what will happen?
Sir, what's happening right now in Manila, there's gonna be overpopulation kasi like you said a while ago. The people in the urban section kasi pupunta sila dito sa city to find more jobs. However, pag napuno na yung jobs din, magkakaroon naman ng unemployment. And then, sa rural naman, magkakaroon din ulit ng demand for more workers.
You are actually correct. No? So let's go back to the slide. Sorry, I thought I actually modified the slides a bit. So Lewis turning point. No? So what's gonna end up happening is, you're right, no? And that's the case of Manila or Cebu or Davao. No? You keep attracting. Kasi nga higher wages, and then they don't have jobs in the countryside. What's gonna happen is there's no more surplus labor. No? Of course, sa urban side, what's going to happen is you have some congestion if there's weak urban planning, etc., etc. But the silver lining there is rural wages now start to go up. Kasi what's going to end up happening is instead of there being a surplus, wala nang surplus. Then, since the wages in the urban areas are higher, then even those who are already employed, no? Kasi wala nang surplus, remember, fully employed na lahat, even those who are already employed in the farms now get attracted to the urban centers because the wages are higher. So, the law of supply and demand says, no, if there's scarcity, kasi wages lang naman are think of wages as any kind of good, no? Meron din silang upward and downward pressure. No? So pag ganon, what's gonna end up happening is the rural farm owners now are forced to increase the wages just to keep. That's your parang supply and demand push. Diba? No more rural labor, and even those who are employed in the farms get attracted to the high wages in the urban centers. No choice yung rural wages but to go up. Diba? And then, urban wages also eventually will go up. Kasi nga there's that parang tussle. No? Kasi they want to keep sort of attracting the workers. Dito to retain, dito to keep. Or to pull, no? To pirate in a sense. So, yun, it's law of demand and supply as well. There's that tension. Just let me know, no, if you guys have questions. So that's the Lewis dual factor. And later on we'll summarize what's good about it. No? So why are we studying this phenomenon? Sige Marco, go ahead.
I don't know if we'll discuss this later. Pero siguro like naisip ko dito is yung balik probinsya program. Like, diba, again, like you stated a while ago, na the reason why the people go to the cities is to find more jobs. But like if we just let the people go back to their provinces, it's gonna be bad because there's no jobs there. And then another question is like, I don't think it's possible that the wages will go up because there's I mean for the reason that they're trying to retain when there's actually a reserve workforce, meaning that if pagpapatanggal kayo ng mga workers, meron namang iba dyan na naghahanap for the work. I don't, what's your take on this?
That's correct. No, we'll cover those two questions later. We'll cover yung first mo yung balik probinsya. No, that's actually a criticism of the Lewis dual factor. We'll get to that. We'll get to that in 2 slides or so. Yung second mo naman, yes and no. Many countries kasi, that's why for example in the Philippines, no, as an aside, no, the minimum wage, at least in the urban centers, no, or even in the rural centers, have not really gone up. Kasi again, law of supply and demand. Because maraming unskilled, no choice sila but to get the what job is available. What ends up happening is, yun, tanggalin mo sila, mare-replace lang easily. So there's no upward pressure. Pero we will learn, no, from the China model. Sorry kung ano. But there are other, even Vietnam can be a model. No? Pero when we talk about the Lewis, and I'll discuss this, Marco, no, in the next 2 slides. So let's go to the China model, no, para mas ito. So that's the Lewis term. It's also in the previous slide. Sige, dito na lang muna before we go to the China example. So the criticism, let's go to Marco's point. No? The criticism actually of Lewis is, again, it's also the same criticism as Rostow. No? Parang they're trying to dichotomize agriculture and manufacturing. But if you think about it, in rural areas even, no? And this has been proven in, let's say, the Netherlands, in the US, no? Agriculture and manufacturing and industry can actually coexist. So sometimes they don't even have to go out of their area. Pwede na eh. Diba? Yung criticism of the balik probinsya is actually, yeah, they're sending them back to the countryside, pero wala namang jobs. Pero the argument of Lewis is actually, the criticism of Lewis is, it need not be like that. If government, both national and local government, no, mga provinces, are able to entice, let's say, investments, no, or facilitate investments, no, you can have jobs, no, both urban and rural, well-paying jobs pag may investment, kasi they can coexist dapat. If the country is planned well, no, wherever you go, no, you can find jobs that are quality jobs, whether it's agriculture industry. So kay Lewis kasi, they parang backward ang agriculture industry. Even agriculture can be an industry. When you go to food processing, counted na siya actually as manufacturing or industry. Hindi na siya agriculture. So that's one of the criticisms of Lewis. Parang it can coexist actually. Hindi siya dapat dinadichotomize all the time. Ayun, so businesses don't always invest back in profit. This is the criticism din, yung assumption ni Lewis, no? Na, sige, urban industries will keep just flowing back their profits into investments, no? Balik sa business. Hindi. Actually, they can either keep it for themselves, if you think badly of them, or they can just buy advanced equipment that will actually replace humans. Diba? You no longer need humans. So, putol yung argument ni Lewis. Kumbaga, instead of them attracting more workers, parang they themselves, ayaw ko na ng workers. So that's a potential criticism. And the assumption actually of excess rural labor is not empirically sound. It seems intuitive, pero in many cases, they haven't really found a solid empirical basis for this. Kasi in many ways, the problem is, yes, rural wages are lower definitely than urban areas, pero it doesn't mean that there is huge unemployment or surplus labor in the rural side. But what is it good for? Again, yun nga, when we're talking about models, no, economic development or growth models, all of these are imperfect. Any model is imperfect. Kaya nga siya model lang. It's many of these are theoretical, sometimes rooted in empirical basis, pero hindi siya perfect. No model here that we're studying is perfect. Well, one is it's a good description, no? And we'll go to the Chinese example later on. This has been cited by, if you go to your Canvas course, no, there are two Financial Times or Al Jazeera ano yata videos on the China model, no? As a parang that's the uh, most often cited case of the Lewis model, no? The Lewis turning point, no? Where yun nga. And the good thing with Lewis is it's a good examination of wage range determinants. No? Kasi as we'll talk about the Chinese model later on, the wages actually, no, because they were able to establish solid manufacturing hubs. No, it attracted rural wages, rural workers, and then actually they noticed that in the countryside, wages also started going up. And that brings us to the most important point of the Lewis dual factor model. Go align to the Rostow where manufacturing is a must. When you want to develop a country, you want to boost its economic productivity, you have to focus on manufacturing. But again, going back to the criticism of both Lewis and Rostow, manufacturing and agriculture need not be dichotomized. You can actually combine them. No? Agro food processing, for example, agribusiness, yung mga Pampangas best, or mga tocino, whatever. Those processed food products actually are considered manufacturing already, no? Because they will entail higher economic greater economic productivity, and they will lead to higher employment, etc., etc. So the lesson of Lewis is focus on manufacturing, even in the agriculture sector. Kasi yun, aside from it improving or generating greater economic productivity, it actually has spillover effects to the rural areas even. No? It can increase wages to a certain extent, as we'll see in the Chinese model. So for those of you, maybe at least a few of you have gone through the Canvas course. What's the story behind China, no? And it's it being a good sort of illustration of the Lewis dual factor, or having reached the Lewis turning point. Has anyone seen this on Canvas already, the video on China? If not, sige lang. I'll narrate it for you. And I hope you have time, no, to actually go through this on Canvas. So, as you know naman, no, China, since the 1990s, early 2000s, and even up to now, no, although less so, no, has become the factory of the world. That's what they were called. No? So before, di ba? Especially when you guys were growing up, you have CDR King, you have everything Chinese, etc. Even the devices that you use right now are most likely manufactured in China. Kahit US brand yan, that's more or less manufactured in China. So what happened was when the former president of China in the late 80s, early 90s reformed the economy so that it can become a more market-oriented economy. No? They ushered in reforms. No, they attracted investments. They made sure that their people were well educated. You have a lot of PhDs, people, etc. So they started. That facilitated, investments. No? People, even multinational companies, setting up shop there, and then just becoming a manufacturing hub. The good thing was, with globalization, transport shipping costs became much lower. So you can have like US companies getting their goods done in China or somewhere else and then shipping it back, and cheap lang yon, yung transport cost. So what happened was they set up a lot of manufacturing, industrialization really happened. No? It actually attracted rural migrant workers. No? So what ended up happening is those workers that they were attracting, many of them actually came from the countryside. So what ended up happening, the wages then from the rural side started rising. And then what followed soon is the urban wages also increased. No? Kasi nagkakaubusan basically. No? When there is scarcity, when there's always an element of scarcity, what ends up happening is prices tend to go up. Whether that's wages, whether that's oil, whether that's diamonds or water, whatever. When something becomes a little bit scarce, you would expect the price to go up. So ito, nawawala ng workers, they keep attracting. So the rural side, no choice, but may tendency to go up. But there is the problem now. No? The problem now is if your wages keep rising, no, that's good for the workers, definitely, di ba? Pero the problem now, no, there's always trade-offs kasi when you're studying the economy. The trade-off now naman is China became a known for global competitiveness. No? They were known to be the factory of the world. What ended up happening, wages across the board, across the country started going up. Then, of course, labor is a component of what you sell, diba? That's still a cost, diba? If you think about it. What ended up happening was the wages went up, the prices now started going up. These other, at least the multinational companies or international companies, started going elsewhere, leaving China. Kasi nga, mas mura na ngayon si Vietnam, mas mura na si Bangladesh, for example, for garments. No? But the good thing with China, they've still specialized in high-tech stuff, no? Na hindi pa kaya, let's say, ng Philippines, Vietnam, Thailand. Thailand to a certain extent. But the infrastructure is still with China. No? So ngayon, you'll notice that less sophisticated stuff have transferred global manufacturing, no? Garments have largely transferred to Vietnam, Philippines, Cambodia, Thailand, Vietnam. Kasi yun nga, sometimes if wages go up, you'll be less competitive globally. But of course, it's good for the workers. So may trade-off. So that's a good case study of the Lewis dual factor. And China is the often cited example of this, of them having reached the turning point. But again, yun nga, no? If you specialize in manufacturing, no, it's good for the economy, plus it's also good for the workers. Diba? Kasi you have you give them jobs, and at the same time you force all areas to actually have their wages go up. So meron kahit papaano na effect like that. Just let me know if you have questions. No? So what about the Philippine economy? No? Kasi we talked about the sectoral composition of the economy. No? So it's composed of three things: agriculture, manufacturing, services. When we say agriculture here, it refers to very basic agriculture. It's crop production, growing, let's say, eggplant, selling it, yung baboy, no, selling livestock or poultry, that's it, no. Manufacturing, even food manufacturing, no, converting the parts of the pig to processed pork products, that's already counted as manufacturing. Manufacturing is transforming something from its original state. So even yung mga food, it's no longer counted as agriculture, it's now manufacturing and services. So sinasabi nga ng Lewis and most classic economics textbooks, and this is sort of a gospel truth na, no? Even I subscribe to this. Manufacturing is king. For an economy, no, yes, everyone can start out backward subsistence agriculture. Ito yung parang usual trajectory, no? Dapat agri muna, rosto, di ba? Then manufacturing, then when the economy is more affluent, services na. No? Predominantly, so share yan. No? So dati, agriculture is, let's say, 70% of the economy. Now it should be down to 30%, mas large manufacturing, then eventually services. That is supposed to be the general trend, no? The problem with the Philippines, and I'm showing you this graph now, no? And you can learn more. I even included an economist article on Canvas. Here, you'll see no, agriculture since the early 20, since 2010, and even before, no, has been slowly declining. This is percent share of GDP. No? Kasi kina-quantify nila magkano yung agriculture production versus manufacturing versus services. So ito, declining siya. No? So last year, which, well, it has improved in the last 3 years. No? So relatively 1 out of 10, no? 10% of production in the economy is attributed to the agriculture sector. Manufacturing accounts for around less than 30%. But services takes the lion's share. Services nga, that's anywhere from call centers to financial services to catering to your mom and pop services, janitorial, whatever. The problem with services, no, in most developing countries, it's low backward, low productivity services. No? So minsan dito yung janitorial services, yung mga ganon, it's not high value. Kaya sinasabi nila, that's actually not the kind of services that we want. The problem with the Philippines, we leapfrog, no? Instead of us doing this step by step, no? Agri muna, tapos solid manufacturing, biglang tumalon tayo from agri to services without a solid, robust manufacturing industry. There's a big problem with that kasi manufacturing, if you go to empirical basis, really provides the bulk of employment. It's the #1 employment generator. Plus, it creates a lot of, when we go to Module 4, no, when we talk about the clusters, Module 5 pala, when we talk about the clusters, no, when you engage kasi in manufacturing, ang nanganganak siya, no, it's connected to the support commodities, the inputs, ang dami niya kasing connected industries. No? So it really, if you really want boost economic productivity and employment, manufacturing is the way to go. The problem with us, we went straight to services, and most of these are low quality services without having a more solid manufacturing base. So naunahan na tayo ng Thailand and soon Vietnam. Indonesia. Indonesia medyo same. I'll just keep going. So what's the Marxist paradigm? This is the next naman. So we're shifting gears now. We're done with Lewis, with the structural approach. We also want to cover Marxist paradigm. So what is it? Why is Karl Marx or the Marxist paradigm very popular? Sige, Marco, go ahead.
I guess it can summarize it to say that there's the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. So basically, proletariat is the working class, or so that's our workers, farmers, and such. And then the bourgeoisie or the capital, sila yung nag-exploit ka ako sa mga proletariats because that's due to lower wages or exploitation. So like there's this rate of exploitation that Karl Marx put in Das Kapital. So basically, that's it's also one of the paradigms that criticizes the capitalist system that we have.
Sorry, I muted myself. Sige, that's, sorry, what am I doing? You're absolutely correct, no? So it's exactly, no? So you have two groups, no? Parang dual ano rin yan. Dual sector, no? So the Marxist paradigm, and this is sort of his theory that this is the trajectory of the global economy or individual countries' economies, no? This is what's going to end up happening. So what happens is what Marco was saying, no? At present, no, it's usually the capitalists exploiting workers. And for Karl Marx, no, of course, people, no, mas ang important element talaga are the workers, no, the working class. So what happens, no, and this is his sort of his prediction, what will happen at the end, ultimately. So yun nga, they keep exploiting the workers, and then capitalism continues to add capital, no, meaning capital, yung durable goods, no, so factories, expansion, no. What ends up happening is, the economy stalls, no. At the end of the day, there's recession, fewer buyers, less demand, no. The businesses start losing profit. Diba? Usually naman, if you follow the economic trends, there's booms and busts, no. So sometimes because the economy is in a bad shape, no, there's less consumer demand. So businesses don't sell that much. Sometimes they go bankrupt. No? So for example, ngayong pandemic, no, the economy has stalled, no. So businesses start losing profit, and since the workers now feel exploited and they are exploited, no, it will lead, no, to class revolts, riots, no, revolution, and that dissatisfaction eventually turns into preference for socialism. Later on, and as I mentioned last time, no, socialism naman is there's that class revolt, and then the revolutionary group are the ones, no, who are able to establish a new government. And that new government, no, is now in charge of deciding who gets what. No, who gets what? Itong share mo, ganun. And communism is actually later on, no, I'll show a spectrum, is the most extreme. And I actually shared 2 articles to you guys. No? It's the most extreme form of socialism. Sometimes people consider it as separate, but sometimes people consider it as part of socialism, but in a more extreme form. Kasi socialism, the moderate kind, so to speak, no, government pretty much dictates most things, no, but there is still some room for personal what do you call this? Sandali lang, Marco. There's still room for personal liberties. So ito, no, going back to Rostow, the prediction of Marx, no, is hindi nagtatapos kasi Rostow ended with high mass consumption, no. Here, because the economy crashes and then there is riot, no, eventually countries' economies will now go to socialism. No? Yun yung parang the end, the ultimate. And to a certain extent, Russia actually tried this model. Pero sila naging more extreme in the sense na parang mas communism na sila. Go ahead, Marco.
Actually, I think it's more of, since it says that communism is the abolishment of private property.
Sorry?
Ang social communism is basically the abolishment of private property. Tapos, basically, socialism is basically the transition towards communism. Like you said, iba ang socialism sa communism. Mas extreme nga ang communism because communism is just not just abolishment of private property, but it's also the withering of the state. So, hindi pa talaga maging internationalistic ang relations natin. So, yeah, maybe just to add, kasi yung sinabi mo na
We'll go to the international what do you call it? International interpretation of this. Actually, it's in the next slide, no? Marco. But that's a good point. No? Some people subscribe to that paradigm. Sorry, Marco, medyo choppy sometimes. No? I don't know if it's my connection or not. Sige lang. No? But I'm trying to, as much as I can. Let me just increase my volume here. Just to be sure. Sandali lang, ha? Give me time. I'll increase my audio so that I can hear it more. All right. Sige. So that's the basic Marxist paradigm. The international dimension naman is what we call now the neo-Marxist paradigm. It's basically the lens, the Marxist lens, no, in international relations. So ito naman, instead of the capitalists versus the working class, it's actually the rich countries, no, the colonists usually, no, yung mga and versus their former colonies, no, exploiting them. So for example, tayo being exploited by the US or Spain, for example, or the Western countries, no. Parang yung theory naman dito, and again, these are all theories, no. Some people really subscribe to them. Some people say, ay hindi, mali. No? But of course, I will not say this is wrong, completely right. But there is this paradigm as well. I can only speak for my own, from my own experience and my own analysis. No? Pero ito, so just to explain the basic model, no? So yun nga, parang it's like the capitalist, no? There is an incentive for them to keep exploiting. No? So there's an incentive for, let's say, the US to keep exploiting us. Better to keep them that way. No? Parang I will extract resources, I will extract whatever I can. No? Pero I will also throw a bone once in a while. No? Bigyan ko ng ganitong aid, ganyan. So I become dependent. No? It's better if I keep them poor. No? Pero not poor para they can also buy what I'm selling. So may konting level of ano rin, income no, na pwede na so they can buy my stuff but they cannot be super rich because I want them to keep dependent on me. It's very extractive. No? Yun nga. So in many ways, no, a lot of groups, no, there's a particular movement here in the Philippines, no. I hate to generalize, no, but for example, if you go through the Makabayan block, no, I think, no, I don't know, I might be wrong. No, most of these party list groups under the Makabayan block subscribe to this ideology that, kaya nga you see, no, yung US, patalsiking, rehimeng US name of the current president. So Duterte, whatever it is, no. So they don't believe, for example, that Duterte is baka fake lang yun, no? Duterte is parang going to China talagang under the US pa rin. So there is that also paradigm. My own experience, no, of course you can tell me I'm biased, no, but I've worked abroad, I worked in the Philippines, I worked in government, civil society. As I mentioned, I think you were the one who asked this, Marco, before. I don't think developed countries are intentionally exploiting developing countries. At least now. Before, yes. Before, yes. No? So sometimes they're taking advantage of, let's say, more comparative advantages like lower wages, lower cost of inputs, etc. Yun. And then I think at least for the US, may mga efforts naman, and again governments are not monolithic, no. So syempre may mga strands of government that they still want to keep certain countries under them, pero in many ways naman as a whole, no, let's say Western governments now see the value of trying to help countries develop. Kami, for example, I work for USAID, no. Hindi naman evil yung USAID, no. Of course, there's that diplomacy angle, but we are now trying to help the country improve, no, not to keep them dependent from us. So, but again, as I'm telling you, I'm not saying na what I'm saying is completely correct, no, or what they're saying is completely wrong, no. I don't personally subscribe to this idea, but some groups still subscribe to this idea because that is the Marxist paradigm. No? There's two warring factions, one exploits the other. And there's a benefit for the exploiters to keep doing that. So yeah, in a nutshell, that's neo-Marxism. This is similar, no? There's another paradigm. This is correct. Actually, I practically agree with this. Not 100%, but I agree with this. There's also a false paradigm model. So in module 3, we're basically exploring different models, different paradigms. There's also what we call the false paradigm model. It's not It's kind of related to the neo-Marxist model, no? Pero this one naman is this is actually more of a warning, not necessarily a model to follow. Um, what sometimes what progressives are saying is sometimes no, you have the elite core. Ito siguro ito na yung link niya with the neo-Marxism. You have the elite core of societies, let's say Filipino economies. Most of them study abroad in developed countries. And syempre, na-brainwash na sila in terms of what works, what doesn't work, approaches. No? So what sometimes ends up happening is they Western countries vis-a-vis developing countries, they try to replicate what worked there. No? But the problem is, sometimes yun nga, hindi necessarily tama yan. No? What works in one country does not necessarily mean it will work in let's say the Philippines or in Thailand or Indonesia, Cambodia or Africa, or most countries in Africa. So in the 1980s, just to illustrate this, no, yun nga, yung sinasabi ko, elites, no, sometimes they accuse, no, this paradigm accuses the rich people, the economists, the think tanks, no, of actually being brainwashed by Western. Kasi in many cases, yung mga elites naman natin, the smart ones, actually went to school abroad. So ang illustration dito is in the late 1980s, no, there was this thing called the Washington Consensus. The Washington Consensus was in the 80s, no, a lot of countries were going through financial crisis, economic crisis, like mga Latin American countries, Chile, even us. No? And the World Bank before and the IMF were notorious for prescribing a set of policies, no, that, you know, ito na yun. It's a cookie cutter approach. No? Parang template na siya. No? For all countries going through some sort of economic crisis, you do the following. Kasi it has worked in our country. But what ended up happening was, no, sometimes they actually created more harm than good. Diba? Parang ito, I will not necessarily, I'll just discuss this in brief. No? So for example, no, some countries were having hardship, no, fiscal discipline. Naghihirap na nga ng mga tao, but yet they're saying, don't spend too much. Sometimes kailangan, but you know, and then tax reform, no? You have to keep imposing taxes or cutting taxes, no? It depends, no? You have to open up your economy, no? You have to, foreign direct investment, etc. No? You have to privatize state enterprises, etc. Some of these are good in the right context. No? Actually, most of these are good in the proper context. But the problem is they came up, no? You don't have to memorize this, no? But it's in Canvas, no? What these policies are. No? I can discuss this if you want, no? One-on-one, pero I won't bore you with all of this because this is not an economics course. But the point here is do not necessarily prescribe something because it worked in another country. It has to be nuanced. So that is the false paradigm. No? Don't copy models just because they work in other countries. So it's the same here. No? Make sure it's applicable. Now, fishing might have worked in a particular area, but maybe not. So you have to, there are sort of global good practices, pero think muna if it's applicable to a particular economy. So same with all the models that we've done. No? Rosto, think of it applicable ba siya? No? In many cases, baka naman. So any policies that work in other countries will not necessarily work in other countries. That's just what the false paradigm model is saying. All right. And the last, no? And I told you, no, we're done in an hour, no? So ito na yon, yung sinasabi ko kanina, no? So there's this spectrum, if you will, no? This might be an imperfect spectrum. I just came up with this last night. No? Sabi ko to better illustrate it for you guys. No? In general, so from anarchy to communism. No? So again, I'm partial to social democracy. It's still a capitalist democratic framework, but it's not letting businesses just do what they want. There's strong government regulations. There's also strong programs to address inequality. Going back to the capabilities approach, you help equalize opportunities, not incomes, but opportunities, so that they can chart their own path to get the income that they would eventually aspire for. Socialism tsaka communism, medyo extreme na siya because here, it's still trying to equalize. No? It's still trying to equalize things. No? Pero ito, it's through strong government control. Socialism, may konti pang private liberties. Communism, medyo wala na. And usually, communism is the end result of a violent revolution. Socialism kasi pwedeng democratically elected pa sila in many cases. So yeah. And this is your typical capitalist democracy. That's why it's in the middle. And then dito market fundamentalism or less government control. Tapos even social programs pwedeng wala or limited even here. So this is my preference. And I hope for most of you as well. Anarchy obviously is talagang labo-labo. No government control or authority. So that's module 3 part 2. So next week, we're going to finish module 3. The last part is very short. No? That's contemporary naman. We visited the classic models, the older models. We'll talk about a more holistic, environmentally sustainable framework. No? The donut economics. So keep, and we'll introduce module 4, by the way. So keep, covering or keep learning from Canvas. No? And again, these sessions are short because they're meant to summarize and complement what you've been learning on Canvas. So don't treat this as your parang primary learning tool. No? It's Canvas. No? This is more complementary. Any questions? Any comments? So for your assignments, maybe give me roughly a week or 10 days to finish checking your papers. I have 2 classes, so I think I have roughly almost 60 students, so it will take me some time. So I'll try to check them during the weekend and give you the results by next week. All right. Any questions? Additional comments?
None for me, sir.
All right. I think we're good. All right. Thanks, guys. Thanks for joining. Have a good evening. Have a good dinner.
Thanks.
Have a
Good
good
night, sir.
Thank you, sir. Have a good evening.
Good night.
Thank you,
Good night,
sir.
everybody.